Hello guys, I'm Greg, here to show you today on how to remove and replace the alternator and serpentine belt tensioner on your Volkswagen CC or Passat 2.0 liter TSI. Now, as far as what other vehicles can use these same step-by-step instructions, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. My vehicle is a 2012 Volkswagen CC Sport, again 2.0 turbo TSI. So please look through my instructions. I actually had my serpentine belt go out, and that's why I'm going to go ahead and replace it. I'm actually finished with the replacement. I like to shoot these videos after the fact just so I could share some lessons learned, the tools I actually used, and maybe give you some tips to save you some time and frustration later on. This is the actual timing belt tensioner, and I figured I'd also gear the video towards alternator replacement because it's one of the parts that we're going to actually remove and reinstall. So if you're looking to replace your alternator, these instructions would help you too. But this is the belt tensioner. Now, one of the things I do want to say before we get kicked off here is please, when your belt is going out, cracking, or it's just, you have so many miles on it, please do not just replace the belt. I tell you all the time, I've done this on several other vehicles, and one of the things I always regret is either helping someone or doing myself, changing the belt and not the tensioner. It's always going to come back to bite you in the ass. So spend a little bit extra money, do it the right way the first time, that way you're not worrying about it. I went ahead and went with the genuine Volkswagen parts here, so I bought it at my local dealership. Now, lessons learned, I could have got it cheaper online. I'll put the actual part numbers of the tensioner, the belt I purchased below, genuine Volkswagen part numbers, but you can get them from a lot of online stores a little bit cheaper. So I will put the stores and the links to the place where I would have bought them if I would do this again. So okay. Now my old belt, this is the old tensioner, was shredded, so it's in the trash. I'm not going to waste my time showing that to you. Also, there was no clear-cut instructions I could find anywhere online, so that's why I went ahead and took my time, and I'm making this video. Is hopefully it'll help someone else. So I didn't shoot a lot of video when I was actually changing it, but I did take a lot of pictures with my smartphone. So while I post those pictures on this video, I'll go in and do a voiceover of some of the things to look out for and some of the things to do as we go along, as well as what tools I'm using as we go. All right, so this is the actual tensioner. One of the things I do want to mention as you get your tensioner, first things up, you'll usually get a lock pin. So it is spring loaded and there is tension on it. This is the original Volkswagen kind of lock that went in there. When I was taking my old one out, I used a small screw. I think this is a 8mm, 10mm, just something to fix in there as I put tension on it, lock it in place. I do want to mention this little plastic piece that keeps falling out of the bottom. I first thought this might have been something just in there for shipping purposes, but it is a functional part of the assembly. When you remove the old one, you want to make sure that's in there when you replace it with the new one. And what you'll eventually be doing here is a little bit different. The only thing that holds this thing in place is you actually slip this thing into a bracket. On the back end, there's a little plastic bushing that you'll slide in, kind of center it, and then this Allen head bolt is the one thing that actually holds it in place. I'll go over the tools. It is an Allen head bolt, and just so you know, I do have it here. It is an Allen size 5, so you'll need an Allen key to go ahead and remove that. When I reinstalled mine, since it's such a small bolt, I went and put a little dab of blue Loctite on it before I torqued it down. Okay. Another thing I want to mention as far as lessons learned, when I pulled this thing out, I cleaned it up here, but I did know a little film of lubricant. So what I went ahead and did, because I put on a lot of my other bolts anyway, is I put a little anti-seize. I was wearing gloves at the time, so I just put a real light coat on it, a little bit on the assembly, so that when I slide it in, it went in smooth. One of the things I do want to mention is this little sleeve. When you finally do pull out your tensioner, this sleeve is going to be stuck in there. There's a little spacer thing. You don't want to force it out. You don't want to muscle it out. What I've learned with these things is just put your finger in there, feel around, and then just finesse it out. Just slowly work your way out, and it pops right out. And same thing when you're putting back in. When you have this tensioner in, you're gonna have time. You have to perfectly center it before it slips in. And then also, I'll talk to you more about this bolt. When you do remove your alternator to get to this thing, there is going to be a bracket that is right here. You literally cannot move or get to this bolt without moving that bracket. Rather than unbolting that bracket, what I simply did was just bend it back. It's a metal bracket. It's kind of where the battery cable mounts the alternator. It's a bracket that holds that. So I pushed it back and I pushed it up just so I can get a socket in here to remove this, and I'll show you more about that later. Matter of fact, this is the screwdriver I used when I had that bracket to push it back and then pry it up so I can get to that bolt. So it's one of them. It's number 3 flathead screwdriver. It's one of the tools that I used. But yeah, so let's go into talk about some of the tools I used. One of the first things you'll do is you'll remove the negative post from your battery. You're going to be removing the alternator, so it's definitely a hot connection. So 10 millimeter socket, 1/4 inch ratchet, simply removes that. I also use this 1/4 inch ratchet for a few other things to get in there real tight. This is a Harbor Freight ratchet, composite, right? Really cheap, but actually it's one of my favorite ratchets to use. Let's talk about ratchets for then. Now this is a lot of overkill. This is a 1/4 inch snap-on ratchet. As you can see, it locks in place and it's flexible. To remove that bolt, that Allen head bolt, Allen head number 5 metric, I use this. Quite frankly, this was a lot overkill to remove and replace. If you have simply one of those Allen keys, the little L keys, that's number 5 millimeter, that would have done the job just perfect. Matter of fact, the biggest thing is this right here. You want to make sure there's a bracket you're going to go into. You need some clearance. An Allen key would have went in there with even more clearance. So this is a lot of overkill, but I use it, so I want to just show you what I used. Okay, this is a 3/8 ratchet, another snap-on one, flexible head. This thing was a champ when it came to removing the alternator. Alternator's got 4 bolts. They are, just let me confirm here, 13 millimeter socket. And this thing to get in there for the tops, matter of fact, even the ones in the bottom, it's a little bit tighter because the electric fan is right here. This thing worked like a champ. So great investment. I've used it in a few projects now, but fairly new to me. Just extending magnet. You know, you drop your bolts. I do them all the time. Fall under the vehicle. This one from Lowe's actually has Cobalt brand. Actually, it has a little LED light, so I like it. And again, it extends, contracts, so I used it. We will be using a few Apex bits, and this is just my Craftsman, Sears Craftsman holder I've used. I usually lock it in place. I don't use a ratcheting mechanism, but I use that, and I'll talk more about actually, let's talk about them now. I have an entire set of bits I use. I love this thing. I bought it at Fry's Electronics. I don't know, I doubt they have Fry's Electronics. I'm here in Las Vegas. We have one down the street. I know there's one in San Diego, so just look online. As far as it's 100-piece assorted power bits. Brand is Boxer's, little boxer dog on it. I've used this thing, and the bits are really strong, great variety, and it's paid for itself probably 5 times over. But some of I talked about the Allen Head 5. These are some Torx bit I use. You're going to have to remove the little plastic skid plate underneath the vehicle, and it's a Torx size 5, right? So that's the bit I use. I'm sorry, Torx. It's Torx size 20. Torx size 20. Now remove. There's 7 little screws to kind of remove that plastic shield. Also, there's a Torx 30 that you're going to use. Let me remember. When you're removing the alternator, there are some plastic coolant hoses that are screwed into the intake manifold, the plastic intake manifold, where there's 2 screws. I recommend you pull them out just so those hoses a little bit more. You can move them around just to pull that alternator out. The screws are a Torx 30, so I put them on this little extension here on a ratchet, and I was able to get those screws no problem. Put that on a ratchet. Those 2 screws came out no problem, and it gave you a lot more slack to move things around. So those are the Apex bits. I'll go to move on. This is a little snap-on 1/4 inch socket that takes 1/4 inch Apex bits. So I just purchased this. I used this a lot when I was in the Air Force. Love it. Make things a whole much easier. I talked about the number 3 flathead screwdriver. This one doesn't matter. This is actually one of my good ones. I wouldn't recommend it. All I really use this thing is to push and pry the bracket, and then when I was pulling this thing out, once you unbolt it to put it in the engine, it actually just pries right out pretty. To pull it for you, because it's a perfect fit in there, for you to pull it out, it's pretty hard. But once I put this thing on there, I pried it out. Came out pretty easy. So yeah, I would use your junk screwdriver though. In hindsight, use that. I mentioned. I also, this is pretty big though. I used some anti-seize. Every one of my bolts that went into aluminum bracket or whatnot, I put some anti-seize on just so there's no corrosion that builds up and you don't get that bind later on. Underneath the vehicle, I'll show you a picture of an engine mount that you're going to have to remove. You will have to lower the engine in the vehicle you have to lower the engine in the vehicle just so this thing can pull out, because you're hitting a side of the fender. I looked online a few places. I estimated maybe 5 inches you'd have to drop it. That was fairly accurate, 4 or 5 inches. And I'll talk to you about lowering it as little as possible. So when you pull this thing out, just maneuver it so it pops out easy. There's some areas where it might come out like this. If you just rotate it, usually it just comes right out. But anyway, that engine mount bracket at the bottom is a pretty big. There's 2 bolts that are, let me confirm here, 16 millimeter, so 16 millimeter socket, and there's a big one here, and let me make sure this is right, 21 millimeter socket. You're going to need to remove those, and that allows the engine to drop, and that's underneath the vehicle, and I'll show you a picture of that as we go along. A few other things. I have an extra 1/4 inch 13 millimeter socket. I used, really not necessary, some extra ones. I also have some really short extensions for both my 3/4 and my 3/8 and 1/4 inch sockets, just real short ones. I can't tell you if they were absolutely necessary, but I used them. Finally, to relieve the tension on this tensioner, this is an Easy Red brand wrench. It is ratcheting, it is reversible, it is lockable. As you can see, it's flexible. So this bolt on your ratchet, it's going to be 17 millimeters. I love this because it was really tight clearance. So it went in there, no problem either way. It's exactly what I bought this for. They come in a set, and I'll put a link in the description below. So 17 millimeter. Can you just use your regular wrench? I love this because it's long and it's so much easier on torque. Could you use a socket? I'll be honest with you, I couldn't remember. But could you use a shorter wrench? Absolutely. 17 millimeter box wrench. I do have some breaker bars and a really 1/2 inch ratchet, pretty long one. This one's a Harbor Freight breaker bar. I use this to snap the engine mount bolts at the bottom of the engine. That thing was a beast and it took some effort, so this breaker bar did come in handy. If you have a shorter breaker bar, you're just going to have to pull a little more ass into it. But also, I use this. This is a really big 1/2 inch snap-on ratchet, also flexible head locking. I know most people aren't going to use this, but I use this to just remove bolts at the bottom. Also, you're going to have to undo the top mount, which is 18 millimeter. And I recommend a deep well socket. If you don't have a deep well 18 millimeter, a short 18 millimeter with an extension would do just fine. But I use this to snap the engine bolts and tighten them at the top of the engine. So if not, you have a shorter one, and you use an impact, you want to use this, just takes a little bit more time, breaker bar. But again, an 18 millimeter socket for the 2 engine mount bolts at the top of the motor. Right? I think I went through everything else here. Lessons learned: I never regret buying genuine parts. I just regret where I bought them. I paid a little bit too much. My local dealership gives me a military discount, so they gave me 10% off, which, thank you, I appreciate that. Lessons learned: you're going to need, some obvious things. You're going to need to jack the vehicle up, so make sure you have a jack and some jack stands, not too high. I have seen some videos, people messing around with some of the belts and whatnot in the vehicle. They actually removed the passenger side front tire. I didn't. Behind that front tire, there's a little plastic shield there. Would it made it a little bit easier? Yeah, it made it a little bit easier because it's pretty tough to get the belt behind the crank pulley. But I did it without it. No big deal. A couple extra steps, and took me some time to just tuck that belt behind that crank pulley. But it worked out, so I didn't have to do that. You can certainly do that, make it maybe a little bit easier. But you don't need to remove that tire or that little plastic shield to remove the actual belt tensioner. Matter of fact, if you're removing the alternator, you don't have to even jack the vehicle up at all. So a little bit of lessons learned. If you are doing this, it's a great time to, if you think your alternator is on its way out, it's a great time to replace your alternator. Also a few other things. That's about it. Again, I didn't take a lot of video, but as I go through these images, I'll try my best to narrate through it, walk you through it, give you some tips. Please, this is my first time doing it. If there is any feedback of tools that made it easier for you, products that are a little bit better than the ones I use, or you have any comments in terms of techniques to make things easier, by all means, please put it in the comments section. If you would, I'm just trying to make these videos hopefully to help other people, save them some time and frustration, maybe even some money. Please give me a like, give me a thumbs up. I appreciate if you subscribe to my channel, and give me some feedback on how I could do things a little bit better. All right. Well, thank you for now. I'm going to go ahead and move on, and let's walk through this thing.
Alright guys, to get things started, what you're first going to do is jack up the front of your Volkswagen, just the front, not the rear, using a floor jack, and go ahead and secure it with jack stands so everything is nice and safe for you. If you are doing just the alternator replacement, this is not necessary. You can keep the car on the ground and go ahead and do that swap. But if you can do the full tensioner, the belt, go ahead and jack it up and secure the vehicle. So this is a nice little image, came out of a shop manual. There you see the alternator, kind of see the bracketry, and I'll show you a few more pictures of the alternator here in a second. The second thing you'll see there is the serpentine belt tensioner, and if you follow this diagram, it kind of shows you where it slips into that aluminum bracket that bolts to the engine. Finally, you'll see the actual serpentine belt, and you'll see kind of the layout of the route in which the belt runs through the pulleys. One thing I always recommend before you remove these belts is to do that. Get a piece of paper, a pen, draw a little diagram of the pulleys, and show the route in which the belt. It sounds silly, but it saves so much frustration later on. Those things are the kind of things you tend to forget as you're working on the vehicle. But yeah, it gives you a nice understanding kind of the parts that we're going to be working on here, and you can identify them in your engine as we get started. Next, we'll go to the battery box. Usually has a plastic cover. Go ahead and remove the cover, and with a 10mm wrench or socket and ratchet, go ahead and disconnect the negative terminal on the battery, and go ahead and take that negative cable and tuck it away so it doesn't accidentally touch that terminal when you're working on it. We are going to be removing the alternator, which is going to be a hot line from this battery, so we want to make sure there's no sparks and everything is safe. Here you have a little bit better view of the alternator, and then also the 4 bolts you're going to have to remove. These are 13mm bolts, so I recommend a short 13mm socket. If you have a long ratchet with a little flex head, that's also helpful in this manner, and you go ahead and remove that. Another thing when you're pulling the alternator out might be helpful is these are the 2 coolant hoses that are screwed into the intake manifold. Torx 30, remove those 2 screws. It's just going to allow you to get those hoses and kind of move them out of the way as you're pulling the alternator out. Makes it a little bit easier. Also, I recommend unbolt the alternator and pull it out just a little bit before you go ahead and remove the rear terminal on the alternator. And I'll show you that in another picture here in a second. So here's a picture of that alternator, and when you unbolt the alternator, try to shift it a little bit towards the passenger side of the vehicle a little bit, and you'll see there's a plug that you're going to have to remove. Be careful when you're moving this, don't break anything, it is plastic. And go ahead and push down on the pin, pull it out. Shouldn't be too. Mine came out fairly easy. And finally is the power cable plug. So this was coming straight from the battery, and you have a little plastic cover you'll have to pry out with a screwdriver. Pops right out. Mine dropped to the floor. And then with a 13mm socket and ratchet, you can go ahead and unscrew the battery terminal. And also, please make sure that when you are putting this back in, you're reassembling it, put that plug back on because it is a hot connection. You don't want to one day when you're working on your motor touch that thing and get a spark or anything like that. So please be careful and go and put that plug back on. Alright, now so this image shows you a little bit better picture of the tensioner where it's time to pull the belt out and lock that tensioner in place. So right there, go ahead and get a 17mm long wrench or a long ratchet and a 17mm socket. Relieve the tension on that tensioner. Pull the belt off, and you'll notice there is also a little pin you could put in to lock the tensioner in place. And I've seen people use a really big nail, an Allen key. I used like an 8 or 10mm screw I stuck in there to keep it in place. And I like this picture because it shows you that you're also going to have that sleeve in the back, number 4, and then also the Allen head bolt that secures it in place. Remember, I mentioned earlier that you want to, when you remove that, there is a bracket blocking that bolt, so you're going to have to kind of bend that bracket out of the way. And I have a few better pictures of that bracket here in a second, but when you put the new screw back in, the new bolt back in, that Allen size 5, I believe, I put a dab of blue Loctite on there just to secure it in place because it is the only thing holding that tensioner in there. This picture is just a good reference. Shows you once you pull the alternator out, this is some of the hardware you're going to see in there. So that is the battery cable that you pulled out, removing that 13mm nut. This is that plug you put out of the back of the alternator. And then finally it shows you back where is that Allen plug. You see a little image of that bracket. I'm going to tell you to move out of the way, and I have a zoom in picture of that bracket here in a second to give you a better idea of what you're going to be doing. Alright, here's that bracket that's blocking that Allen plug. Again, I'm going to get a screwdriver, put it on that bracket, and first you want to push it towards the driver's side about a 1/2 inch, and then when you get it down that way, what you want to do is pry it up to get it out of the way so you can access that bolt with either an Allen key or a socket.
So now we're moving to the bottom of the vehicle, and you see this is the little plastic shield at the bottom of the vehicle. So Torx bit 20, size 20, and 7 screws. Go ahead and remove them. Remove the screws, remove the skid shield, and get them out of the way, completely out of the way, because we're going to be moving the jack underneath the car here in a second. So next we want to prepare to lower the vehicle. There is a mount in the bottom we want to remove. So right here you see a 21mm bolt, really pretty big one. Make sure you get your breaker bar or a long 1/2 inch ratchet. And then we also have 2 60mm bolts on that blue bracket that we want to remove. This way we can easily lower the vehicle. Once you remove these bolts, that red and blue bracket, go ahead and remove them and get them out of the way so that they don't get pinched in there as we lower the engine. Next we'll move on to the passenger side of the vehicle. Right there below the crank pulley you'll see this hose. This is an air hose coming from the intercooler. You don't got to remove the hose completely, just as I showed you there. Go ahead and remove that clamp. It's a little wire clip that goes all the way around. Remove that, pull that side of the hose out, and just leave one side removed so that we can have some flex room as we lower the engine. So I don't have a picture for this next part, but what you'll do essentially is get your floor jack, and on the jack pad I folded a pretty thick rag just not to scratch any part of the oil pan. Put it under your oil pan and jack it up just right underneath, enough to support it. Not going to jack up on the engine, but just enough to support it, because the next thing we're going to do is remove the upper engine mount and begin to lower the engine. So here we're back on the top of the engine, and we follow to that tip of that screwdriver. That is the belt tensioner. We're going to go ahead and pry it out about halfway out using a flathead screwdriver, just so that when we do lower the vehicle, we lower it just enough where we could actually maneuver that thing and pull it out without going too low. Let's now move the upper engine mount.
and actually not remove it, but just go ahead and remove the bolts, and we'll leave the mount actually staying in there. So 2 18mm bolts. I'm going to recommend a deep socket, but if you have a short socket with a short extension, that works too. Go ahead and remove those bolts completely, because again, the engine underneath should be supported by a jack by now, and remove the bolts, but not the actual mount. Now that those engine bolts are removed, go ahead and go back to your floor jack and slowly release the pressure on it, lowering the engine about 4 to 5 inches. I would do it gradually, and as soon as you're low enough to just again maneuver that tensioner around, and just enough to pull it out. We don't want to stretch any hoses or anything that we don't have to. Pull that tensioner out, the old one. Go ahead and slip the new one back in, and realistically, from here on out, everything is pretty much just the reversal of the installation, reversal of removal. So put things back together and replace your tensioner, tighten it down, so on and so forth, adding your new belt. Everything else I would do in the installation, like add a little Loctite on that tensioner bolt I mentioned already earlier. This is just a picture of your new belt and the label on the box that came in, genuine Volkswagen. I'm going to go ahead and put those part numbers down in the description anyway, but just so you know what you're looking at as far as a new belt, this is what it is. And finally, guys, this is a picture of your new tensioner, the little centering sleeve, the plastic sleeve, the mounting bolt, as well as the part numbers in the box, which I'll put that in the description as well. But yeah, guys, the installation is pretty much the reversal of the removal, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope it'll be helpful to you. So please give me some feedback on what you liked, how I could do better in these videos, and I'll see you on the next one. Catch you later. Bye.